Kethvar stared at the assignment document floating before his 6 eyes and felt what humans might call disappointment. The Zenthari Collective had chosen him for this mission because of his expertise in xenobiology, but studying humans felt like punishment rather than honor. Every other species in the Galactic Defense Coalition had interesting traits worth documenting. The Kolari could phase through solid matter. The Thasan possessed natural armor that could stop plasma bolts. The Vexani communicated through controlled electromagnetic pulses that could disable enemy equipment. Humans had nothing special at all. They were soft creatures made of fragile flesh and brittle bones. Their reaction times were slower than most sentient species. They could not survive in vacuum without artificial protection. They required constant intake of water and organic matter to function. Their lifespans were embarrassingly short by galactic standards. Most puzzling of all, they experienced emotions that interfered with logical decision-making. Fear, anger, sadness, and joy clouded their judgment in ways that made other species uncomfortable. The briefing hologram activated and showed Admiral Zeth Kar of the Zenthari Military Command. His voice carried the usual tone of professional boredom that characterized most military communications. Observer Kethvar, you will document human combat behavior during the current crisis on Kepler 442b. The Vorthek Empire has launched a major offensive against coalition forces. Human units have been assigned to the northern front. Kethvar's primary manipulator appendages twitched with curiosity despite his lack of enthusiasm for the assignment. The northern front is considered the most dangerous sector according to tactical reports. Why were humans given such a critical position? The admiral's expression remained neutral, but Kethvar detected subtle signs of what other species might interpret as skepticism. The humans volunteered for that assignment. Their commanding officer specifically requested the most challenging position available. Coalition Command approved their request. This information struck Kethvar as highly illogical. Most species preferred safer positions that maximized survival probability while minimizing resource expenditure. The Zenthari had perfected this approach over centuries of warfare. They calculated optimal risk-to-benefit ratios for every military engagement and positioned their forces accordingly. This strategy had made them successful members of the coalition and respected throughout the galaxy. What are my specific observation parameters? Kethvar asked while reviewing the tactical data flowing across his visual interface. Document their decision-making processes under stress. Record their tactical adaptations to changing battlefield conditions. Most importantly, analyze their unit cohesion when facing superior enemy forces. Previous reports suggest humans become unpredictable when confronted with overwhelming odds. Kethvar understood the unspoken implications of this assignment. The collective expected humans to fail spectacularly under pressure. His documentation would provide useful data for future military planning and might support arguments for limiting human involvement in critical operations. Every other species had demonstrated reliable behavioral patterns during combat. Humans remained an unknown variable that made military planners nervous. The transport ship delivered him to Kepler 442b 3 days later. The planet's surface showed clear signs of prolonged warfare. Orbital bombardment had created massive craters across the northern continent. Atmospheric readings indicated the presence of various chemical weapons that made breathing dangerous for most species. Coalition bases dotted the landscape like small islands of organized resistance against the advancing Vorthek forces. The human base appeared chaotic compared to the sterile efficiency of other coalition facilities. Temporary structures had been erected without regard for geometric precision. Soldiers moved between buildings, following paths that seemed random rather than logically planned. Equipment sat in apparently disorganized piles rather than neat storage arrays. The entire facility looked like it had been constructed by beings who prioritized speed over proper planning. Colonel Jake Morrison met Kethfor at the landing pad and immediately demonstrated the peculiar human habit of extending his hand in greeting. The gesture served no apparent practical purpose, but seemed important to human social protocols. Morrison appeared to be in his early 40s by human standards, with graying hair and facial lines that indicated significant stress or advanced age. His uniform showed signs of recent combat activity, including small tears and discoloration from various substances. "Welcome to Firebase Alpha," Morrison said with what humans call a smile. The facial expression involved pulling the corners of his mouth upward in a way that was supposed to indicate friendliness, but looked somewhat disturbing to Kethfor's visual processing systems. "I hope you're ready for some excitement, because things have been pretty busy around here lately." Kethfor activated his recording equipment and began documenting his first impressions. The human commander seemed remarkably relaxed, considering the tactical situation reports he had reviewed during the journey. Enemy forces significantly outnumbered coalition defenders. Supply lines remained vulnerable to constant attack. Casualty rates had been climbing steadily for the past 2 weeks. Yet Morrison displayed none of the stress indicators that would be expected from a competent military leader facing such circumstances. "Your situation reports indicate significant challenges," Kethfor observed while scanning the base perimeter with his sensor equipment. "How do you assess your unit's probability of successful mission completion?" Morrison's smile widened in a way that suggested he found the question amusing rather than concerning. "Well, we're still here and the bad guys aren't, so I'd say we're doing pretty well so far. My people know what they're doing, and we've got some tricks up our sleeves that might surprise you." This response exemplified the illogical optimism that characterized human behavior according to preliminary studies. Morrison seemed genuinely confident despite facing overwhelming tactical disadvantages. Either he was engaging in deliberate deception to mislead the observer, or humans possessed some form of cognitive dysfunction that prevented accurate threat assessment. The tour of the base continued with introductions to various human personnel. Sergeant Lisa Martinez supervised weapons maintenance while joking with her subordinates about topics completely unrelated to their current military situation. Private Danny Rodriguez shared food rations with fellow soldiers and seemed genuinely happy, despite the constant sound of distant artillery fire. Captain Amy Foster reviewed defensive positions with calm efficiency that suggested years of combat experience. Yet she took time to ask about Kethfor's comfort and dietary requirements. Most puzzling aspect of human behavior was their apparent disregard for proper emotional responses to danger. Every few minutes, Vorthok artillery shells exploded within hearing range of the base. Sniper fire occasionally struck the outer perimeter walls. Reconnaissance drones flew overhead gathering intelligence for future attacks. Yet the humans continued their daily activities with minimal signs of stress or concern. During the evening meal, Morrison invited Kethfor to join the human officers for what they called dinner. The food consisted of processed organic matter compressed into rectangular packages that humans referred to as MREs or meals, ready to eat. The taste was barely tolerable, even by human standards. Yet the soldiers consumed these rations while maintaining conversation about family members, recreational activities, and personal interests that had nothing to do with military operations. "So what do you think of our little operation here?" Morrison asked, while consuming what appeared to be artificially flavored protein paste labeled as beef stew. Kethfor considered his response carefully. Honesty would require admitting that human behavior seemed completely irrational by accepted military standards. Diplomacy suggested providing a more neutral assessment that would not offend his hosts. "Your personnel demonstrate interesting approaches to stress management under combat conditions." Several humans laughed at this comment, which puzzled Kethfor. Further, since nothing about the situation seemed humorous, Morrison nodded, as if the observer's words carried deeper meaning than intended. That's one way to put it. We've learned that keeping morale up makes a big difference when things get tough. Tomorrow should give you a better idea of how we handle ourselves when the pressure really starts building. Cuthbert spent the rest of the evening reviewing his initial observations and preparing preliminary reports for transmission to the collective. His first assessment confirmed most expectations about human military capabilities. They appeared disorganized, emotionally unstable, and poorly adapted for serious combat operations. Their equipment was functional, but inferior to standard coalition technology. Their tactical preparation seemed adequate, but not exceptional. Only anomaly was their apparent confidence in the face of overwhelming odds. This could indicate either dangerous overconfidence that would lead to catastrophic failure, or some hidden capability that was not immediately apparent to outside observers. Cuthbert made a note to investigate this phenomenon more thoroughly during the coming days. The attack began at dawn with a sound that made Cuthbert's entire exoskeleton vibrate. Vorthic artillery opened fire from positions 15 kilometers away, sending plasma charges screaming through the morning air toward the human base. The ground shook with each impact as defensive barriers absorbed the initial bombardment. Warning sirens activated throughout Firebase Alpha, but the humans responded to the emergency alert with practiced efficiency rather than panic. KTH single quotes VA are observed this transformation from his protected observation post near the command center. Within minutes, the chaotic human base became a coordinated military machine. Soldiers who had been joking over breakfast now moved with purpose and precision. Equipment that had seemed randomly scattered was suddenly in exactly the right positions. For defensive operations, the apparent disorganization had been an illusion concealing careful preparation. Colonel Morrison appeared at the command center wearing full combat armor and carrying weapons that looked well maintained despite their simple design. His relaxed demeanor from the previous evening had been replaced by focused intensity, but Cuthbert noticed that the human commander showed no signs of fear or confusion. "Looks like our guests decided to throw us a party," Morrison announced. To his staff, "Let's make sure they get a proper welcome." A tactical display showed the scope of the Vorthic offensive. 3 full divisions of enemy forces were advancing toward coalition positions across a front spanning 200 kilometers. Hunter-killer drones filled the air above advancing ground troops. Heavy weapons platforms provided mobile artillery support while aerial units prepared to establish air superiority over the battlefield. The enemy force possessed overwhelming numerical and technological advantages that should have guaranteed quick victory. Communications reports from other coalition sectors painted a grim picture. Kalari units requested immediate evacuation after their phasing abilities proved ineffective against Vorthic quantum disruptors. Thassan forces retreated when enemy plasma weapons penetrated their natural armor. The Zenthari garrison withdrew to prepared secondary positions after calculating that their current location could not be held without unacceptable casualties. Only the humans remained in their forward positions. "Sir, Coalition Command is ordering general withdrawal to Defensive Line Delta," reported Communications Officer Beth Turner from her position at the radio equipment. Her voice remained steady despite the increasing intensity of incoming fire. "All units are requested to begin immediate evacuation procedures." Morrison studied the tactical display for several seconds while explosions continued to shake the command bunker. Cuthbert expected the human commander to acknowledge the logical necessity of retreat and begin preparations for withdrawal. Instead, Morrison activated the all-units communication channel and delivered a message that defied every principle of sound military strategy. "All call signs. This is Alpha Actual. We hold the line here. Repeat, we hold the line. Set condition. read throughout the perimeter, and prepare for sustained defensive operations. This is our ground, and we're not giving it up. The response from human units across the base came back immediately with acknowledgments that suggested complete acceptance of what appeared to be a suicide order. Kethver began documenting what he assumed would be the final hours of the human military. Presence on Kepler 442b. Their destruction would provide valuable data about the consequences of emotional decision-making in combat situations. Captain Amy Foster took control of the eastern defensive positions with calm authority that impressed even Kethver's analytical mind. She moved between bunkers while enemy fire intensified, checking on her soldiers and coordinating fields of fire with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. Her tactical decisions showed clear understanding of proper defensive principles. Yet she had accepted Morrison's order to remain in an untenable position without question or complaint. The first wave of Vorthic ground troops reached the outer perimeter at 0800 hours. Human soldiers opened fire with weapons that seemed primitive compared to advanced coalition technology, but their accuracy was remarkable. Private Danny Rodriguez operated a heavy machine gun from an exposed position that should have been suicidal. Yet he continued firing even when enemy return fire destroyed the protective barriers around his position. Kethver watched through his sensor equipment as medic. Tony Garcia ran across open ground under direct enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers from other coalition species who had been left behind during the general retreat. The human medic moved 3 injured Kolari and 2 wounded Susan to safety, while plasma bolts struck the ground around him. His actions served no strategic purpose and provided no tactical advantage. Yet he repeated these rescue missions throughout the morning. The behavior made no sense according to established military doctrine. Resources should be allocated based on strategic value and probability of successful mission completion. Risking valuable medical personnel to save soldiers from other units was inefficient use of available assets. Yet Garcia continued his rescue efforts, while his own people fought desperately to hold their positions. Heavy weapons specialist Carlos Mendez demonstrated similar irrational dedication to duty when his position came under concentrated attack from a Vorthic assault walker. The enemy machine stood 12 meters tall and mounted plasma cannons capable of destroying fortified positions with single shots. Standard tactical doctrine required immediate withdrawal when faced with such overwhelming firepower. Instead, Mendez remained at his anti-armor weapon and continued firing until the walker was destroyed. Even though his position was completely exposed to enemy retaliation, Communications Officer Beth Turner maintained contact with all human units while her command bunker took direct hits from enemy artillery. Concrete fragments fell around her equipment, but she continued relaying orders and coordinating defensive fire missions with steady professionalism. When her primary communication array was damaged by a near miss, she switched to backup systems without missing a transmission dot by midday. The tactical situation had become desperate by any rational assessment. Human ammunition supplies were running low. Several defensive positions had been overrun by enemy forces. Casualty reports indicated that the unit was losing effectiveness at an unsustainable rate. Coalition Command transmitted repeated orders for immediate withdrawal, but Morrison continued to refuse evacuation. The breaking point came when Private Kevin Johnson's squad found themselves surrounded by advancing Vorthic infantry after their defensive position was bypassed by enemy flanking maneuvers. Standard military procedure required them to attempt escape and evasion to preserve combat effectiveness for future operations. Instead, Johnson's team established a defensive perimeter and fought to delay the enemy advance, knowing they could not survive the encounter. Kethver monitored their final radio transmissions with growing confusion about human decision-making processes. Alpha 6, this is Bravo 2. were cut off and taking heavy fire. Estimate 30 enemy infantry moving toward your position. We'll hold them here as long as possible. Morrison's response demonstrated the same irrational commitment that seemed to characterize all human military behavior. Negative, Bravo 2. Break contact and withdraw to Rally Point Charlie. That's an order. Johnson's reply came back immediately, with what sounded like amusement in his voice, despite the desperate circumstances. Sorry, sir, but the radio seems to be malfunctioning. Can't hear your transmission clearly. We'll continue current mission. Until further notice. The squad fought for 47 minutes against overwhelming odds. Their sacrifice delayed the enemy advance long enough for other human units to reposition and establish new defensive lines. When the position was finally overrun, Coalition reconnaissance confirmed that all 6 humans had died at their posts, while inflicting casualties that were tactically insignificant but somehow strategically important. Sergeant Lisa Martinez led the counterattack to rescue pinned Coalition forces with similar disregard for personal survival. Her assault team moved through enemy fire to reach trapped Xanthari soldiers who had been unable to complete their withdrawal. The rescue mission succeeded, but 3 humans died in the process of saving 5 aliens they had never met before. The current operation, the pattern repeated throughout the day as human soldiers, demonstrated behavior that defied every principle of logical military planning. They fought harder when outnumbered. They took greater risks when facing superior firepower. They showed increased determination when tactical conditions became hopeless. Their actions served no comprehensible strategic purpose, yet somehow maintained defensive effectiveness against impossible odds. Private Alex Rivera provided the most disturbing example when his position was overrun by a Vorthik heavy walker that had broken through the eastern perimeter. Instead of retreating or surrendering, Rivera armed demolition charges and ran directly at the enemy machine. His sacrifice destroyed the walker and prevented a breakthrough that would have collapsed the entire defensive line. Kethfer found himself unable to process what he was observing. Human behavior contradicted every established theory about rational decision-making under stress. The second day brought horrors that violated every principle of civilized warfare. Vorthik forces deployed biological weapons in direct violation of galactic conventions, releasing airborne toxins designed to cause painful death through respiratory system failure. The clouds of poisonous gas drifted across Coalition positions like yellow fog, forcing immediate evacuation of all personnel without proper protective equipment. Kethvar watched through his sealed observation chamber as alien Coalition forces fled their positions in organized retreat. Kaleri units phased through solid barriers to escape contaminated areas. Thasan troops activated emergency beacon for immediate extraction. Xanthari commanders calculated acceptable exposure levels and withdrew when environmental conditions exceeded safety parameters. The retreat was logical, efficient, and completely sensible according to established military doctrine. The humans did not retreat. Instead, they established quarantine zones around areas with the highest concentrations of biological agents. Soldiers who lacked proper protection equipment improvised breathing apparatus from available materials. Those with sealed environmental suits shared air supplies with exposed personnel in rotation systems that distributed survival resources according to need rather than rank or species. Dr. Rachel Moore provided the most disturbing example of human decision-making under impossible circumstances. The human field medic moved between treatment areas while wearing minimal protective gear, treating casualties from all Coalition species without regard for contamination risks. Her medical training should have emphasized personal safety protocols that would preserve her ability to help others over extended periods. Instead, she exposed herself to lethal biological agents while providing care to patients who belonged to species she had never encountered before joining the coalition. "Doctor, your exposure levels are approaching critical thresholds," HFY transmitted through the communication system. "Medical protocols require you to limit contact with contaminated personnel." Moore's response came back while she was performing. "Surgery on a wounded Thawson, whose natural armor had been penetrated by Vorthic plasma fire. Thanks for the update, but this patient needs immediate attention. I'll worry about contamination after everyone is stable." The statement defied every principle of resource management that Cathvar had learned during his scientific training. Medical personnel represented valuable assets that should be preserved for maximum utility over time. Risking skilled doctors to save individual patients was inefficient allocation of limited resources. Yet Moore continued her work while biological toxins accumulated in her respiratory system at levels that would soon cause permanent damage. Lieutenant Paul Henderson demonstrated similar irrational behavior when he volunteered to lead search and rescue missions into the most heavily contaminated areas. His team consisted of soldiers who lacked proper protective equipment but possessed specialized skills needed for urban combat operations. They moved through poisoned streets looking for trapped civilians. While their equipment registered exposure levels that exceeded safe parameters within the first hour of operations, the rescue missions served no strategic military purpose. Civilian evacuation was the responsibility of dedicated relief organizations, not combat infantry units. Henderson's soldiers could have been used more effectively in defensive positions where their combat skills would contribute to overall mission success. Instead, they risked their lives searching ruined buildings for alien families they had never met. Coalition Command transmitted evacuation orders that should have resolved the tactical dilemma facing human forces. Transport ships arrived at designated landing zones with capacity for all remaining personnel and equipment. The withdrawal plan provided safe passage to secondary defensive positions where proper decontamination facilities were available. Medical treatment for biological weapon exposure could begin immediately upon arrival at the new location. Colonel Morrison received the evacuation orders while standing in his contaminated command center, breathing air that contained sufficient toxins to kill most sentient beings within hours. His staff waited for instructions while monitoring communication channels that carried increasingly urgent demands for immediate compliance with withdrawal directives. The logical choice was obvious to everyone except the humans who had to make it. "All units, this is Alpha Actual," Morrison announced over the general communication channel. "Coalition Command has authorized full evacuation for all personnel. Transport assets are standing by at Landing Zone Delta for immediate departure." Cathvar prepared to document the human withdrawal and expected Morrison to conclude his transmission with standard evacuation procedures. Instead, the human commander delivered a message that challenged every assumption about rational decision-making under extreme circumstances. "However, we have confirmed reports of approximately 3,000 civilian refugees trapped in the city center. These people cannot reach the evacuation zone without assistance due to contamination levels and enemy activity. I am requesting volunteers for extended rescue operations." The response from human units came back immediately with overwhelming acceptance of what amounted to a suicide mission. Every squad leader, every specialist, every soldier in Firebase Alpha volunteered to remain behind, despite knowing that biological contamination would kill them within days. They understood the consequences of their choice, yet they made it without hesitation or complaint. Cathvar found himself unable to process the implications of what he was observing. 400 human soldiers had chosen certain death to save 3,000 alien civilians who belonged to species they barely understood. The rescue operation would provide no tactical advantage and would eliminate an entire battalion of trained military personnel. By any rational calculation, The mission was a waste of resources that served no strategic purpose. Yet the humans began preparing for extended operations with the same professional efficiency they had shown during conventional combat. Equipment was redistributed to maximize effectiveness of available resources. Ammunition was allocated based on mission requirements rather than personal survival needs. Medical supplies were reserved primarily for treating rescued civilians rather than protecting the soldiers conducting rescue operations. Sergeant First, Class Maria Gonzalez, recorded final messages to her family while cleaning weapons that would be needed for the rescue missions. Her video transmission showed no signs of fear or regret, despite the certain knowledge that she would never see her loved ones again. "Tell my kids that Mommy is doing something important," she said while checking ammunition supplies. "Tell them that sometimes doing the right thing costs more than we want to pay, but we pay it anyway, because that's what makes us human." Private First Class Ryan Clark provided another example of human emotional responses that defied logical analysis. A young soldier was barely 19 years old, according to his service record, yet he faced approaching death with what appeared to be genuine humor. "Well, I guess I'm going to miss my mom's cooking after all," he commented while loading equipment onto vehicles that would carry rescue teams into contaminated zones. "She's going to be really upset about that. She always said her food was to die for, but I don't think this is what she meant." The other soldiers laughed at his comment, which demonstrated the peculiar human ability to find amusement in desperate circumstances. Kethvar could not understand how beings facing certain death could maintain emotional states associated with happiness and social bonding. Their behavior suggested either complete psychological breakdown or access to mental resources that other species did not possess. Staff Sergeant Nicole Peters distributed extra ammunition to rescue teams while discussing tactical approaches for urban operations in contaminated environments. Her planning showed clear understanding of the challenges they would face and realistic assessment of their survival prospects. Yet she maintained professional competence while organizing missions that she knew would result in her death and the deaths of everyone under her command. Captain Amy Foster reviewed defensive positions that could not be held by remaining personnel, while planning evacuation routes for rescued civilians. Her tactical analysis was thorough and professional, despite the obvious futility of the overall mission. She allocated resources with careful attention to efficiency, while preparing for operations that would consume those resources without producing any strategic benefit for human forces. The 72-hour siege began at sunset, when Vorthic forces launched their final assault against Firebase Alpha. Enemy commanders had calculated that biological weapons would eliminate effective resistance within the contaminated zone, making conquest a simple matter of occupying abandoned positions. They had not anticipated that human forces would remain in place despite exposure to lethal toxins. The battle developed into a grinding urban warfare scenario as Vorthic infantry advanced through streets filled with poisonous gas, while human teams moved through the same contaminated areas, searching for trapped civilians. Combat occurred simultaneously with rescue operations as soldiers fought enemy forces while carrying alien refugees to safety. The final assault began on the third morning with a bombardment that shook the entire city. Vorthic commanders had committed their remaining reserves to eliminate the human resistance that had disrupted their entire offensive operation. Heavy artillery pounded Firebase Alpha, while aerial units established air superiority over the urban combat zone. Ground forces advanced in overwhelming numbers that should have guaranteed quick victory against the remaining defenders. Kethvar monitored the tactical situation from his protected observation post, while human ammunition supplies reached critically low levels. Soldiers were rationing bullets like precious resources, making every shot count while enemy forces approached their final defensive positions. Equipment that had been carefully maintained throughout the siege was now showing signs of irreparable damage from continuous use under impossible conditions. The humans had fought beyond all reasonable limits of endurance. Biological contamination had reduced their physical capabilities to barely functional levels. Combat casualties had eliminated most of their heavy weapons, specialists, and technical personnel. Supply shortages meant that basic necessities like food, water, and medical supplies were no longer available in sufficient quantities to sustain operations. Yet they continued fighting with determination that seemed to increase as their situation became more hopeless. Colonel Morrison's final transmission came through communication equipment that was failing due to damage from enemy fire and environmental contamination. His voice was barely recognizable due to effects of biological toxin exposure, but his message carried the same professional calm that had characterized his leadership throughout the siege. All stations, this is Alpha Actual. Ammunition is critically low across all positions. Enemy forces are beginning final assault phase. Estimate 15 minutes until perimeter is breached. It has been an honor serving with each and every one of you. Make your shots count, and remember why we stayed. The response from human units came back with acknowledgments that demonstrated their acceptance of approaching death and their continued commitment to the mission they had chosen. Squad leaders reported their status with matter-of-fact professionalism that treated certain doom as just another tactical consideration to be managed efficiently. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brooks took control of the western approach, where enemy forces were concentrating for their breakthrough attempt. Her position was already compromised by artillery damage, and her remaining soldiers lacked sufficient ammunition for sustained defensive fire. Standard military doctrine required immediate withdrawal to secondary positions where better defensive advantages might be available. Instead, Brooks organized a counterattack designed to buy additional time for civilian evacuation operations that were still ongoing in the city center. Her assault team consisted of 12 soldiers armed with weapons that had barely enough ammunition for a single engagement. They advanced toward enemy positions that were defended by hundreds of Vorthic infantry supported by heavy weapons platforms. The attack succeeded through sheer audacity and tactical surprise that enemy commanders had not anticipated. Human forces struck at the exact moment when Vorthic troops were preparing their own assault, disrupting enemy timing and creating confusion that lasted long enough for rescue teams to evacuate another group of trapped civilians. Brooks and her soldiers died in the process, but their sacrifice bought 23 additional minutes for rescue operations. Master Sergeant Frank Taylor provided the most dramatic example of human commitment to principles that transcended personal survival when enemy forces breached the main gate of Firebase Alpha. The defensive position was critical to maintaining evacuation routes, but it was being overrun by advancing Vorthic infantry, who outnumbered the remaining defenders by more than 10 to 1. Taylor ordered his remaining soldiers to fall back to secondary positions while he maintained defensive fire from the gatehouse that commanded the main approach. His decision meant certain death, but it would delay enemy advance long enough for evacuation operations to continue. Standard tactical doctrine emphasized preserving experienced personnel for future operations rather than wasting them in hopeless last stands. Cuthbert watched through his sensor equipment as Taylor fought alone against overwhelming odds for 20 minutes that felt like hours. The human soldier used every piece of available cover while making each shot count against enemy forces that should have overrun his position within seconds. His defensive fire was so accurate and sustained that Vorthic commanders assumed they were facing a much larger force and committed additional resources to eliminating what they thought was a reinforced defensive position. When Taylor's ammunition finally ran out, he continued fighting with improvised weapons and hand-to-hand combat that defied every principle of rational military behavior. His resistance served no strategic purpose, since the position would eventually be overrun regardless of his actions. Yet he continued fighting until enemy forces finally eliminated him through concentrated fire that required significant expenditure of resources and time. Private Maya Patel died while shielding alien children from artillery fragments when a Vorthik bombardment struck the civilian evacuation center she was helping to defend. Her body absorbed shrapnel that would have killed 3 young Kalari who were being prepared for transport to safety. The children survived because a human soldier chose to use her own flesh as armor to protect beings she had never seen before the current crisis. The act served no military purpose and provided no tactical advantage for human forces. Patel's death did not change the strategic situation or improve the prospects for successful mission completion. Yet her sacrifice saved 3 lives that would otherwise have been lost, and those children would grow up because of a choice made by someone who gained nothing from their survival. Cathvar found his scientific objectivity completely shattered by observations that challenged every assumption about intelligent behavior under extreme circumstances. The humans were not fighting for territory or resources or strategic advantage. They were dying for abstract concepts that provided no tangible benefits to their own survival or the survival of their species. The rescue operations continued even as Firebase Alpha fell to overwhelming enemy assault. Human soldiers who were dying from biological contamination carried alien refugees through combat zones while fighting desperate rearguard actions against pursuing Vorthik forces. They used their last ammunition to protect civilians while saving nothing for their own defense. Combat medics treated wounded refugees while being too weak from toxin exposure to stand upright. Engineers repaired evacuation vehicles while taking direct fire from enemy positions. Communication specialists maintained contact with rescue teams while their equipment failed around them. Every human action prioritized the welfare of others over personal survival in ways that violated every principle of evolutionary biology. The final phase of evacuation occurred when coalition reinforcements arrived in sufficient strength to challenge Vorthik air superiority and establish protected corridors for civilian transport. The rescue had succeeded, but the cost was exactly what human commanders had calculated from the beginning. 400 soldiers had volunteered for certain death, and only 47 remained alive when relief forces reached Firebase Alpha. 3,000 alien civilians had been evacuated successfully. The surviving humans refused medical priority treatment when coalition relief forces established field hospitals for casualty processing. Soldiers who were dying from biological contamination insisted that alien civilians receive treatment first, despite having greater claim to available resources based on their military service and sacrifice. Colonel Morrison was found in his command, bunker suffering from multiple wounds and advanced toxin poisoning that should have killed him hours earlier. When medical personnel attempted to provide emergency treatment, his first question was whether all civilian evacuation operations had been completed successfully. He showed no concern for his own condition until receiving confirmation that every trapped refugee had reached safety. "Did everyone get out okay?" Morrison asked while medical sensors indicated that his organ systems were failing from biological weapon exposure. The families in Sector 7 were having trouble reaching the evacuation zone. Did someone go back for them? The medical officer treating him confirmed that all civilian rescues had been successful, but Morrison's response demonstrated the peculiar human focus on others rather than self, even when facing imminent death. Good. That's what matters. My people did their job. Sergeant Lisa Martinez had lost her left leg to artillery fragments, but was attempting to inventory remaining equipment for transfer to relief forces when medics found her. Her primary concern was ensuring that functional weapons and supplies were properly distributed to units that would continue fighting in other sectors. She treated her own severe injuries as secondary considerations compared to logistical efficiency. Cuthbert stared at the blank report template for 6 days without writing a single word. The cursor blinked steadily on his datapad while he struggled to find language that could adequately describe what he had witnessed during the siege of Firebase Alpha. Every sentence he attempted to compose seemed inadequate to convey the magnitude of human actions that had defied every principle of rational behavior while achieving results that conventional military wisdom declared impossible. How could he explain to Xanthari leadership that 400 humans had voluntarily chosen certain death to save 3,000 alien civilians who belonged to species they barely understood? How could he describe tactical decisions that violated every established doctrine, yet produced strategic advantages that could not be achieved through logical planning? Most importantly, how could he convey the emotional impact of witnessing beings who defined courage and sacrifice in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligent life? The preliminary reports from other coalition observers painted a consistent picture of human military capabilities that seemed to expand rather than diminish under extreme pressure. Human units in other sectors had demonstrated similar patterns of behavior that prioritized abstract principles over practical considerations. They fought harder when outnumbered, showed greater determination when facing superior technology, and displayed increased unit cohesion when tactical situations became hopeless. These observations suggested that humans possessed psychological resources that other species lacked or did not understand. Their decision-making processes incorporated moral considerations that took precedence over survival instincts that were universal among known sentient beings. They operated according to ethical frameworks that enabled them to function effectively under conditions that would paralyze other coalition forces with despair or terror. Cuthbert attempted to visit the surviving humans in coalition medical facilities to conduct follow-up interviews that might provide insight into their decision-making processes. The experience proved more disturbing than his battlefield observations because it demonstrated that human behavior remained consistent, even when they were no longer facing immediate threats to their survival. Sergeant Lisa Martinez had lost her left leg during the final assault, but seemed more concerned about the welfare of alien refugees than her own permanent disability. When Cuthbert asked about her decision to remain in exposed positions throughout the siege, her response indicated that she genuinely could not understand why anyone would consider alternative actions. "Those families needed our help," Martinez explained while undergoing physical therapy that would eventually enable her to walk with prosthetic assistance. "You don't abandon people just because helping them is dangerous. That's not how civilized beings behave." Her statement contained assumptions about moral responsibility that were foreign to Xanthari culture. The idea that strangers had automatic claims on personal sacrifice was incomprehensible according to established principles of resource allocation and risk management. Yet Martinez discussed these concepts as if they were self-evident truths that required no justification or explanation. Captain Amy Foster provided similar responses when questioned about her tactical decisions during the siege. She was recovering from multiple wounds that had required extensive surgical intervention, but her primary concerns focused on whether rescue operations had been conducted efficiently and whether all civilian evacuations had been completed successfully. "Could have done better with more time and resources," Foster admitted while reviewing after-action reports that documented her unit's performance. "Some of the evacuation routes were more dangerous than necessary. If we had planned more carefully, we might have saved more people with fewer casualties." Cuthbert found her self-criticism remarkable because human forces had achieved objectives that other coalition species had considered impossible. They had rescued every trapped civilian while fighting off overwhelming enemy forces under conditions that should have resulted in complete mission failure. Yet Foster evaluated their success according to standards that seemed to assume even greater sacrifices would have been acceptable if they had improved Mission results. These interviews revealed that human moral frameworks incorporated expectations for self-sacrifice that exceeded anything found in other coalition cultures. They seemed to regard their own survival as less important than abstract principles like duty, honor, and responsibility to others. Their decision-making processes prioritized collective welfare over individual benefit in ways that challenged basic assumptions about evolutionary psychology. The medical staff treating human casualties reported behavioral patterns that were unprecedented in their experience with wounded soldiers from other species. Humans who were dying from biological contamination insisted that available medical resources be allocated to treating alien refugees first. They refused pain medication to ensure that supplies remained available for patients they considered more deserving of care. Private Danny Rodriguez was suffering from advanced organ failure due to toxin exposure, but had declined treatment that might have extended his life because similar resources could be used to save alien civilians who had better survival prospects. His reasoning demonstrated the peculiar human tendency to calculate value based on factors other than personal benefit. Those kids had their whole lives ahead of them, Rodriguez explained, while his condition continued to deteriorate. I made my choice when I volunteered to stay behind. They didn't choose to be in this situation. It makes sense to help them first. The statement contained logical fallacies that should have been obvious to any rational being. Rodriguez's military service provided valuable skills that could contribute to future coalition operations. His survival would benefit overall military effectiveness in ways that saving random civilians could not match. Yet he prioritized their welfare over his own based on criteria that seemed to ignore practical considerations entirely. Communications. Officer Beth Turner was recovering from injuries sustained during the final enemy assault, but spent her time writing letters to the families of soldiers who had died during rescue operations. Her messages provided detailed accounts of their final actions and attempted to explain why their sacrifice had been meaningful. The letters served no practical purpose and provided no tangible benefit to anyone involved. Yet Turner treated this activity as more important than her own medical treatment. Cuthbert began to understand that his observation mission had revealed something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans had demonstrated capabilities that transcended normal limitations of biological evolution and rational decision-making. They possessed psychological resources that enabled them to function effectively under conditions that would destroy other sentient beings through despair, terror, or simple logical acceptance of futility. Their behavior suggested access to motivational systems that operated independently of survival instincts or resource maximization strategies. They made decisions based on principles that provided no evolutionary advantage yet somehow produced tactical results that exceeded what could be achieved through conventional military methods. The strategic implications extended far beyond immediate military applications. If humans could routinely achieve impossible objectives through moral determination and willingness to sacrifice, then every assumption about coalition military planning would need to be reconsidered. Human forces represented capabilities that could not be calculated using standard tactical mathematics or predicted using established behavioral models. More disturbing was the personal impact of witnessing human actions on Cuthbert's own psychological development. He had begun his observation mission with confidence in Zenthari, superiority based on logical analysis and efficient resource allocation. His people had perfected military strategies that maximized survival probability while minimizing expenditure of valuable assets. The humans had demonstrated that Zenthari efficiency might actually represent a form of moral cowardice that disguised selfishness as rational planning. Their willingness to calculate acceptable losses based on strategic considerations suddenly seemed less like wisdom and more like failure to understand the true meaning of duty and honor. Cuthbert found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about the nature of courage, sacrifice, and military effectiveness that had shaped his entire worldview. The humans had shown him that beings could choose to act according to principles that transcended personal survival without losing tactical effectiveness. In fact, their moral commitments seemed to enhance their combat capabilities in ways that logical analysis could not explain. The final report he eventually submitted to Xanthari leadership contained observations that would challenge established military doctrine and force, uncomfortable questions about coalition approaches to warfare. Human behavior had demonstrated that abstract concepts like honor and duty could produce tangible results that exceeded what could be achieved through practical calculations about costs and benefits.